Today is December 17th, 2011. My name is Diane Rapson, and I'm interviewing Zhenya Gallon. Zhenya has been a resident of Boulder for over 30 years. Currently, she's science editor and writer at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and its parent organization, UCAR, University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. The interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, Boulder Public Library, and is being filmed by Anne-Marie Poyce. Okay, Zhenya, first question. Describe for us where you grew up and talk a little bit about your childhood and your family.
Well, I grew up on the North Shore of Long Island, about an hour by train outside New York City, in a community that, unlike many in post-war Metro New York, was not a new development. It was actually a town by the name of Seacliff on Hempstead Harbor that's about the same age as Boulder and actually has a few characteristics that it shares with Boulder. The era it was created means there's lots of narrow streets with gingerbread houses, a lot of mature trees, there were old orchards, except that it was about 200 feet above the harbor and therefore had a beach as well. It was a town that had been settled, I think, initially as a Methodist camp meeting with tents, so it reminded me of Chautauqua when I got here. And the town was interesting in that it was, many families that had been there for decades or generations, predominantly Methodist and Catholic. And we had a Catholic elementary school next door to the public school. And often one of the questions that was asked when you met a new kid was public or Catholic. So not a lot of Jewish families. You could count them pretty much on one hand, or one or two hands. But right next door to us was the much larger community, the city of Glen Cove. That was a combination of older homes and newer developments, much larger. And when my parents moved to the area right after the Second World War, they joined the conservative synagogue in Glen Cove, but it was too conservative for them. So they and a number of other families got together and founded a Reform temple in Glen Cove, which we were members of. When I attended, I had a bat mitzvah at 13, which was still somewhat uncommon. It was pretty common among Reform temples, though, for young girls to have a bat mitzvah in American. And so I attended the Reform temple, and it was very much of the times, civil rights was very much on the national agenda, and we had a rabbi with progressive views who spoke often about the civil rights movement, what was going on in the country, what was going on in the community of Glen Cove. And my parents were very engaged in that. One of the most important things to know about me is that my history is important to me. Where I come from is important to me. And one of the unavoidable points of history in my life was that both of my parents' families, my family, on both sides was essentially wiped out by the Nazis living in Eastern Europe. I once counted up the ones I knew about, and probably 25 or more people murdered by the Nazis. And so my parents very much felt the impact of that, and so did my brother and I growing up, and that influenced my attitude towards spirituality. It seemed to me that it was very difficult to believe in a personal God looking out for me as an individual and determining my fate given the events of the Holocaust. I could not believe that all of the people who perished in the Holocaust did so because they had somehow offended a bearded man sitting on a cloud writing in a book. So, so the Reform Temple was an important cultural influence, but even more so my parents, particularly my mother, had been a pioneer who left Eastern Europe in the 1930s because she was a socialist Zionist and wanted to help strengthen a kibbutz in what was then British Mandate Palestine. So that's what saved her life. That's what got her out of Europe. My dad came to the States at the age of 16. He had some cousins who had come before and was pretty well established in the States when he went back home to visit his family and met my mom. And they actually were separated by the Second World War. My mom, after she left the kibbutz, she lived in Tel Aviv, and my dad lived in the States when the U.S. declared war on Germany and Japan after Pearl Harbor. My dad, who was already in his early 30s, enlisted. He wanted to be part of that fight. So they weren't able to marry. They corresponded for 10 years. So they weren't able to marry until until 1945, and then came to Long Island. So they were both immigrants, essentially. My brother and I were the children of immigrant parents, and that also influenced my attitude towards culture and history. Very strong influence. When I went to university out of high school, I met a number of other Jewish women in the dorm I was living in who had either some vague notion of what Jewish history and culture, and the religion for that matter, were about, had attended some services, and many who did not, who knew they were Jewish because their parents were Jewish, but they had grown up with pretty much a secular life and didn't know much about the history of Jews anywhere in the world, didn't know about the Jewish culture of Europe, which was pretty much destroyed by the Nazis, the literature, the theater, the different political movements, the language of Yiddish, which conveyed Jewish culture. Any culture is characterized by having rituals and traditions, particular foods, and a particular language that conveys the culture. And one of the effects of the Holocaust was to wipe out the Yiddish language. It's now studied the way Latin is studied. There are very few people who grow up speaking it, except among the ultra-Orthodox of Brooklyn, basically.
What languages were spoken at home?
Well, that's an interesting question because my father, having come here at 16 and having worked very hard to learn English and to lose a trace of an accent during a time when there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country before the Second World War. There was also not very much known about raising bilingual children. So the fear was that children would be confused and they would not learn English properly. And my father's fear is that we would have accents. And then immediately after the war, it was very important to fit in, to not stick out as different. Certainly that fear is quite understandable. So there was a strong desire that we learn English and that we speak it without an accent. It was also the case that they didn't understand that one parent could teach one language and the other. We know this now. But since my father didn't speak Hebrew, and that was the only language either of them would have wished us to learn of the 6 or 7 they each spoke, they didn't think it was an option to raise my brother and me bilingually. So we were both raised English only. When my parents wanted to talk about the children without engaging us in the conversation, they spoke Yiddish to each other. So I grew up learning a lot of Yiddish expressions. When my mother spoke with her best friend, they had gone to bilingual Polish-Hebrew Teachers College in Poland in the 1930s, and they both emigrated to British Palestine. And then to the New York metro area, and they would speak on the phone on the weekends, and they would code switch the way many immigrants do. They would go back and forth between 2 or 3 or 4 languages, Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, Russian primarily, searching for whatever, not even searching, just freely switching among any number of those languages for the right word to express a concept, and that always amazed me. I think one of the results is that I grew up with a really good ear for language. It's very easy for me. I studied Romance languages in high school and in adult life, and I can usually start understanding a language much more quickly than I can speak it, and that's not that unusual. The children learn to understand before they learn to speak, but I'm never very good at learning the grammar and syntax, but I'm always pretty good at making myself understood and of understanding what's being spoken. But my mom taught myself and a young girl who was a friend, and separately taught my brother and this young girl's brother Hebrew after school, but it was coming home from school, sitting down at the table to another lesson being taught by one's mother. So I learned some things, but not enough to say I speak Hebrew at all at this point in my life.
What did your parents tell you, if anything, about what happened during the war?
They were quite frank about what they knew, which was not very much, which was that first, under the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Stalin invaded the part of Poland was a democracy at the time, but Stalin invaded from the east when he and Hitler divvied up Eastern Europe. And so my mother in particular had letters from home saying that they were doing okay under the Soviets, and in particular because they had come from the Ukraine, they had come from Kiev, and were Russian speakers as well as Polish speakers. So they were doing fine under the circumstances under the Soviets. But at some point, I think my mother recalled waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of radios in her apartment in Tel Aviv, and she turned hers on, and it was the reports of Hitler invading Poland. And essentially, neither she nor my father ever heard from anyone in the family again after the war. They went through the Red Cross, checked all the lists, never found out much information about what had happened. So when I was growing up, I talked about this with my mother when I was an adult. She would say, that your grandparents are behind the Iron Curtain. So we don't know, but I think she would not even say we don't know. I think she actually created a myth that they were behind the Iron Curtain, and that's why we never heard from them. And as I got older, she said, well, it's more than that. But she also, as an adult, said, I would tell you that story because in part that was a glimmer of hope that I had. And indeed, one cousin on my father's side emerged in the 1960s. He was indeed behind the Iron Curtain and was not able to communicate until the 1960s when he started writing. And he eventually was able to bring his family to New York. So one cousin on my father's side, one cousin on my mother's side made her way to Israel after my mother had already left. So I also had conversations with my mom in high school about why I needed to go to Sunday school and why we belonged to the temple. It was clear to me that neither of my parents held very strong observant beliefs. I mean, we didn't observe dietary laws, we drove, we were not, and that was typical of Reform families in general, but I had this inkling that, this was not a deeply, they didn't talk about God, quite frankly. So one day I remember I was in the kitchen with my mom and I said, do you believe in God? And she said, no, not particularly in a personal God. I think God is in nature. So I said, why do I have to go to Sunday school? And she said, it's important to know your culture and your history, and it's important to be part of a community. And in the United States, the temple or synagogue was the place to learn those things. And that was what was quite different about Jewish experience in the US as compared to their experience growing up in Europe, where again you had a common language that told you who you were, and you had literature in Yiddish, theater in Yiddish, Yiddish political institutions, Yiddish labor unions, but none of that translated to the US because of the pressure for assimilation. Forget your language, learn English, learn American ways of, cultural ways. Ways of speaking, ways of dressing, ways of interacting with people, how far away you stand from someone when you speak. All of those things that people who grow up inside a culture may not be aware of, but that I wound up being interested in and studying when I studied interpersonal and organizational communication at CU Boulder. So I could accept that. It's like, okay, I'm going to temple because there's a community here and I'm learning about community. But when I graduated from high school and moved away from Long Island, I went to Boston. I went to Boston University for 1 year. I did not seek out the Hillel on campus. I did not seek out anything in particular of a spiritual bent. I was much more focused on figuring out what it meant to be falling in love with young women rather than young men. I'd always had a sense of being different. And I already had a pretty good inkling of what that meant by the age of 14 when I fell in love with my best friend. And she said, I love you too, just not in that way. And so I went through all of the teenage angst of my first love, violins playing, and told a few friends in school, and their reactions told me, oh, I better not talk about this. I better keep it quiet. I better keep it to myself. There's something wrong with it. I had read a book in the attic of some friends of my parents when we were all there for a sleepover out of town. And I think it was Freud, or it was a book about Freud. And what I remember reading is that homosexuals were essentially doomed to a life of loneliness, despair, alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide. And that was the information I had about what it meant to be what was then called homosexual, which I think is a very limiting term because it only expresses something about one's sexuality, which I do think is innate. I think every human being's sexuality is something innate. I think there's a spectrum of human sexuality. I don't think there's either you're all this or you're all that, except, in a normal bell curve, yes, there are some people that are extremely at the heterosexual end, some people who are extremely at the homosexual end in terms of their sexual identity, desire, and expression. But there's this whole continuum in between that our political discussion in this country has pretty much shouted out. But I put myself at the lesbian end of that spectrum. So that's been my identity since I came out in that first year at college. Came out to other people. I was already out to myself, but in the closet, internalizing all the homophobic messages that I was receiving from the culture. But interestingly enough, the very solid background in terms of an identity of difference, an identity of not being part of a homogenated culture, but having a distinct identity as a Jew, which both my parents instilled in me. My father was very active in the temple in terms of maintaining it. He was one of the people who held the physical space for the temple. So again, it wasn't particularly spiritual an expression. It was an expression of the way I interpreted that this is a community that's important to me, and so I'm involved in nurturing this community. So all of that was actually very helpful at the dawn of my awakening as having not just feelings and emotions and a capacity to love and a fear of what that meant, to being involved in the gay lesbian rights movement, which now is the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer identified rights movement. That's been very important in my life. I knew I needed a community. And I knew that there are strengths in standing up for one's identity, for one's sense of difference, that the slings and arrows of prejudice and discrimination can be withstood if one has a strong sense of who one is, who one's community is, and can focus on the strengths of that community. So even though I did not tell my parents because I had a sense that it would upset them, particularly being the child of adult orphans of the Holocaust when we'd lost all of our family, it's a challenge for queer Jews who nowadays can have a family, but in those days it didn't seem like an option, and quite frankly, it's never been on my agenda. I never wanted children. So part of my orientation has been that that's not something I wanted. But in the Jewish community, particularly in the Jewish communities that survived the Holocaust, marriage and children, always a focus of just about any culture you name, but certainly in terms of recovery from the trauma of the Holocaust, having children was a very important part of it. So I didn't talk about any of that with my family. I think my father knew before he died. He died at the age of 60 when I was 20. I think he knew. I don't think he was particularly judgmental. I think he was particularly just worried about how I would make my way. When I did come out to my mother in my 20s, she said, "You're my daughter, I love you." End of story. She said, "I'm only worried for your safety and your happiness." And I knew that that's what she would say. So I was very fortunate in that regard. All of that to say that I wasn't particularly looking for a Jewish community in my 20s. In fact, I didn't see any out lesbian or gay people. I did not hear any rejection of the passage in Leviticus that has been used like a hammer to beat lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people over the head. I was interested in feminism, and feminists were questioning both Judaism and Christianity for their patriarchal foundations, the emergence of monotheism having destroyed worship of the goddess. And I wasn't very well informed about how inaccurate that was when it comes to certain branches of Jewish thought. Certainly all of that needed to emerge from a feminist dialogue with Judaism and Christianity among people who were interested in that subject. But I wasn't interested in it because I didn't feel particularly spiritual, and I was much more focused on coming out and regaining a sense of sanity and mental health, because having heard those messages about basically that I had a mental illness, it took community, and it took a lot of consciousness raising to emerge from that homophobic cloud. Then along came the international meeting of women that the United Nations sponsored was in Denmark. I'm not sure, I think it was somewhere in Scandinavia. In the 1980s, and there was a delegation of women from Palestine who came and expressed their presence and were very well received. I think it was a very important moment in raising the awareness of the existence of a people who were striving for national identity. But there also came from that a backlash against the Jewish women attending the conference, whether or not they were from Israel, whether or not they agreed with the position of the Israeli government. There was a blanket condemnation of all things Jewish within the feminist movement. There was already that suspicion of its patriarchal origins, and now there was this identification with the denial of rights and striving for a state for Palestinians. Now, it just so happened that a lot of the women that I knew and that I was reading about, the people who were advancing feminist theory, were Jews, Jewish women. A lot of them were Jewish lesbians who were beginning to push back against discrimination against lesbians within the feminist movement. And this was active discrimination. This was rejection of lesbians as participants on governing councils, on being speakers or representatives. There was a rejection of, there was a fear, and the same homophobia that pervaded the larger society also. But there was also this prejudice, I'd say not so much discrimination as prejudice, against Jews in the feminist movement because of this emergence of a Palestinian identity and because of the feminist spiritual movement rejecting Judaism more so than Christianity, because Judaism was, after all, the older originating monotheistic religion. It was the first to reject the pantheon of male and female Western gods in favor of a single God who was male identified with the use of the male pronoun. Letty Cotton Pogrebin, one of the pioneering feminist thinkers, and a Jewish woman, wrote an article, I think it was published in Ms., in response to these events that I just described. And I read it, I thought about it, I thought she was right in terms of asserting that there's more than one way to be Jewish. There's more than one approach to Jewish spirituality. There's a tradition of a feminine aspect of higher power, if you will, expressed in words like Shekhinah, expressed in words like Rachum, which means womb, and translates as compassionate one, as a name of God, a name of the unnameable. So it seemed to me that it was important to begin asserting my Jewish identity within my lesbian feminist identity. It reawakened a sense of, that this was an important part of it had never really gone to sleep. It just wasn't something I was expressing a lot. So this was I was living in Boston. I eventually moved to New York. I came to Boulder to study modern dance at Naropa. Its second summer. It was Naropa Institute at the time, and it only existed in the summertime. I came out here for 2 5-week sessions, fell in love with Boulder, acquired Niwat's curse, Niwat's blessing, that I would be destined to return. Went back to the East Coast for a few years and moved here permanently in 1979. And when I was here for a year or two and started making friends, I started meeting other Jewish lesbians, and we were talking about, Passover's coming. Maybe we'd like to get together and have a Seder together. And of course, it wasn't going to be a traditional Seder out of the Manischewitz Haggadah that was sold at all the grocery stores. it was going to be inflected with our understanding of feminist spirituality, of lesbian feminist identity. And so we wrote our own Haggadah, our own story of the Passover Seder, story of Exodus that's read every year at the Seder table.
So was this exclusively a Jewish lesbian experience, or was it larger?
This was 3 women, myself, my friend Jeannie, and my friend Carol. And Jeannie and I had non-Jewish partners. And I think we all may or may not have invited 1 or 2 other people. So we were starting with like 2, 4, 5, 6 or 8 women sitting on the floor in Jeannie's house on Spruce Street. But every year it grew. Word of this, and I don't think we had nothing written down the first year, but word of the Jewish Lesbian Seder began to spread among our friendship networks, so that within a few years, we were 25 or 30 Jews and non-Jews, lesbians, a few gay men. We would fill a living room to the point where we had to climb over chairs to get to the kitchen. We started taking doors off their hinges and setting them up on, everybody would bring 3 phone books, 3 yellow pages. If we were starting the Seder now, we might be in trouble. Not so many people have phone books anymore.
So
we would put them on the doors, on the phone books, and pillows on the floor, and in the tradition of reclining at the Seder table, because once we were slaves and now we are free and we may recline. And we would eventually rope down a number of people, participated in the writing of the Seder Haggadah. There's a time when we would have a discussion. During the Seder, we would pause and talk about a topic. And this was a sort of community nested within the Boulder lesbian community, because around the same time, a group called the Lesbian Connection, TLC, started. It started with a number of professional women and women teaching at the university who felt the need to have a place to socialize where they wouldn't run into their university students or their clients, because this was still a time when being completely out was not necessarily conducive to having a professional life at the University of Colorado or elsewhere. And for the therapists, it was important that they have a space where, well, for the therapists it was complicated. Some of them knew that they would be socializing with their clients, and some of them felt that they needed to stay away unless it was a subgroup that met because they came from a school of therapy where you didn't socialize with your clients. It was an interesting problem in a small community. So within the Lesbian Connection, there were people who attended those monthly potlucks. We used to take over the depot, the old train depot, and fill it. And
this was the larger group.
This was the larger group, but this was how word spread about the Jewish Lesbian Seder, to the point where, and again, there were always, non-Jewish partners involved. One of the characteristics of being a member of any kind of minority within a minority, whether it's GLBT people of color or GLBT Jews, is that your likelihood of having a partner who is not a member of that same sub-minority is very high. So there's a lot of non-Jews within our ongoing lesbian Jewish community because they're partners and they're people who simply are interested and attracted. So one of those huge lesbian seders was held in the home of a non-Jewish woman who said, "I want to be part of this." And we said, "Great." She opened up her home, and we were climbing over the chairs.
So how would you characterize the attitude of the larger community and your smaller Jewish lesbian community?
Well, we're not there yet. How are we doing on time? I see
Good.
smiles, so take some water. So after celebrating these Seders for a while, I think somebody else said, well, let's get together for New Year's as well in the fall. That marks the beginning of the High Holy Days.
What year would that have been?
This is in the 1980s. And so we had a ritual for New Year's as well as a ritual for Passover. Around 1981 or so is when the first Seders were taking place. That small handful of people on Jeannie's living room floor. In the spring of 1995, Jeannie started talking about formalizing what we've been doing, because we've been doing the Seders and the Rosh Hashanah gatherings for all this time. 10 years? That's hard to believe, but I guess it was 10 or more years. At the same time, the Jewish Renewal community of Boulder had been forming. I think it formed around that same year. It came out of the havurah movement inspired by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi and Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach of blessed memory. They had havurot in Boulder. These were small groups that met to have Shabbat in each other's homes and to study spirituality together. So there was a kind of harmonic convergence between the formation of a congregation where Rabbi Tirza Firestone had just become a rabbi, and so the havurot that had been meeting coalesced around having a rabbi incorporating as the Jewish Renewal community of Boulder, and meeting at the Unitarian Church on Pennsylvania Avenue by the time I encountered them. I don't have that early history of Jewish Renewal down very well, but other people could speak to that. So around 1995 or so, at the time that Jeannie was thinking, maybe we want to have a havurah. Oh, and by the way, there's this very bright, dynamic, charismatic female rabbi with a feminist point of view, or with an inclusive point of view. I don't know if she would use the word feminist, but she would certainly use words like egalitarian. I think she and Reb Zalman talk about Jewish Renewal as being egalitarian and ecological and inclusive. So some of us went to check out, what is this all about? And I walked through the door and attended a service, and I immediately felt like I had come home to something I had been looking for, because I had been exploring spiritual questions, certainly since the time that I attended Naropa in 1975. I learned to meditate at Naropa. I learned about Buddhism from a practice point of view. I knew about it as a philosophy. I had done enough reading to know a little bit about it, but I've been interested in haiku, in Zen culture. So I had been a meditation practitioner, more or less dedicated, but certainly it had become an important part of my life since 1975. I walked through the door, I attended services, I heard melodies that rang in my ear as not necessarily the same melodies that I grew up with, but another aspect of culture is music. There are particular scales, there are particular modes, there are particular keys. Certainly the minor key is associated with Jewish music. Particular modal scales are associated with Jewish music. I was hearing Jewish music, and I was a musician. I was trained as a classical musician. After I moved to Boulder, the other thing I did at MROHP was experiment with some new age improvisational music, jazz inflected, and that was an important part of my life. At that point, it was electrified violin and electric bass.
Was music ever part of the havurah?
Oh, absolutely. We were singing, and I was one of the people who knew the songs and would help transmit them, because, again, a lot of the lesbian Jews that formed first the Seder group, later on the havurah, didn't necessarily have any kind of a Jewish education growing up. A lot of people were what's often called gastronomical Jews. The immigrant generation was their grandparents or great-grandparents. They were not particularly from observant families. Some of their families would go to temple or synagogue for the high holidays only, much the way some Christian families go for Easter only. So their connection with Judaism was bagels and lox, matzo ball soup, brisket, whatever their families learned to cook from the grandparents and the great-grandparents who had brought the recipes from predominantly Eastern Europe. The majority of Jews I met living in Boulder. I did meet one or two Sephardic Jews whose ancestry comes from the Mediterranean, from Spain before the Spanish Inquisition, and then predominantly from Turkey and North Africa, which is where those people went after 1492. So, but I knew all the songs. I knew the songs from Temple, and I knew the Israeli folk songs from my mother's experience on the kibbutz and then as a school teacher in Tel Aviv. And because she taught them to me and to others. My mother was involved in Jewish cultural education throughout her life. So I wasn't the only one, but we would remind each other, how does that melody go? We would go look up the words. We would put those into the Haggadah. So coming to Jewish Renewal, which has a rich basis in music and dance, that spoke to, yes, that's where my spirituality lies. Having Jewish Renewal be embracing of Eastern meditation practices and traditions, not only Buddhism, but Sufi practice, the mystical wing of Islam, is valued. I began to recognize, oh, of course, there is more in common among the world religions that are focused on oneness, on the universality of human existence, the shared, what we share as human beings, and on the unknowable, the ineffable, the mysteries of our existence in this universe. Those spiritual traditions across Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they have more in common with each other than they do with the fundamentalist wings of their own religion. So to me, the spiritual battle that is going on in the world today, globally, and I think it's a struggle, it's a conflict of ideas, it's a conflict around what it means to live a good life, to live an ethical life, to live a moral life. That the battle is not between Christianity or Judaism and Islam. The battle is between fundamentalist Orthodox Jews in Israel trying to restrict freedom of expression, trying to restrict who is a real Jew and who is not a real Jew. The Taliban, the Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, they have more in common with each other. And it is a battle between those fundamentalists, authoritarian, patriarchally based, power-based worldviews, and the egalitarian, universalist, living in an open question, not having all the answers, but understanding that there is a power greater than our material existence and material goods. I would put capitalism over here too, because uncontrolled, unregulated capitalism makes materialism a god. And I think we are suffering now in these difficult economic times from what happens when capitalism is allowed to be the only god, to be the only good, when the free market is worshipped, when the worth of a human being is judged by how successful they are on the material plane. So I think there's a crisis of spirituality within our economic crisis. There is a lack of understanding that we are more than what we own and how much we make. So encountering people of similar mind in the Jewish Renewal community made me want to become a member. I think I attended services for a couple of years before I became a member. I think I joined sometime around 1997 or 1998. What I found within the Jewish Renewal community of Boulder, which since has grown and has acquired a name, because there's more than one, there's an old joke about 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, 4 newspapers. I would say 5 political parties. So there's more than one Jewish Renewal community practicing in Boulder now. It's a sign of the strength of that community. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Reb Zalman, moved to Boulder with his wife, Eve Ilson, many years ago. The Jewish population of Boulder County grew enormously in the 1990s so that we can support many different synagogues, havurot of different, across the spectrum in Boulder County. So the community that Reb Tirza is the founding rabbi of is called Congregation Nevei Kodesh, which means Oasis of Holiness, Kodesh, Holiness, Nevei, Oasis. And I became a member, and several of us from our havurah became members, and we said, well, let's be a havurah within Nevei Kodesh, but we always want to be open to people who aren't interested in Nevei Kodesh. We always want to be open to people who identify as secular Jews, who identify more strongly as Buddhist Jews. I identify as a Jewish Buddhist. I'm not sure which way. Doesn't matter. I identify as a hyphenated Jewish Buddhist, and there are many other people in the congregation. Reb Zalman has said there's no particular conflict there. Whether or not he said that, I would be that. But it's very nice to have my views reflected back in the communities that I belong to. So I participate in the Vipassana community of Boulder, which meets on Tuesday nights. We were meeting in the same Unitarian church for a while, so that was a very special space to me. And neither group meets there anymore, but I will always hold a very warm place in my heart for the welcoming provision of a space for both of those communities to grow and flourish in Boulder. So thank you, Unitarian Church of Pennsylvania Avenue.
I want to back up for a minute and talk about the havurah. How did it get its name? And were you aware of the movement in the United States, the havurah movement? And were there other groups exactly like yours?
I would say that when we started with the Seder group, we were not aware that this was happening anywhere in a particular point of view, but actually I'm not sure that's really the case. I think that given what was happening in the second wave of feminism, where women's spirituality groups were forming, drumming groups, Wiccan groups trying to create new ritual. All of that was happening in the same context. So that was one of the foundational, that was part of the zeitgeist. It was in the air, it was the spirit of the times. So from that point of view, yes, we knew what was going on. We knew surely there were other groups. I was actually reading about, well, there was a whole literature forming coming out of lesbian feminism, lesbian spirituality, lesbian Jewish spirituality. I was involved in a political group called New Jewish Agenda. We were working on bringing a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, working for a two-state solution, working for self-determination, 2 states for 2 people. And the motto of New Jewish Agenda was a Jewish voice in the progressive movement and a progressive voice in the Jewish movement. And so that exposed me to a lot of writing from a Jewish progressive feminist perspective. It exposed me to the revival and celebration of the Yiddish language. Writers like Irena Klepfish, herself the child of a Holocaust widow. Her father had been one of the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto, Michael Klepfish of blessed memory. And there was so much, these were intersecting sects, and again, the inclusion of secular Jews was a no-brainer. The inclusion of people on a spectrum of spiritual belief was a no-brainer. So yes, it was part of the firmament of the times, and it didn't take long to figure out that, of course, there were all these feminist Haggadahs being written. There were all of these lesbian feminist Haggadahs, Haggadot. Haggadahs would be Yiddish or English expression of the plural. Haggadot would be the Hebrew expression.
Is that unusual that people would write or create their own Haggadah?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think this was emerging from the spirit of the times, the spirit of inquiry, the spirit of... I think there's something particularly American about it. We are a syncretic culture. Despite all of the pressure to assimilate, to look American, to act American, to give up one's native language, native dress, indeed, inevitably, all of those different cultures that make up our multicultural nation that gathered in people from all over the world. Interestingly enough, the other country I know about that is like Israel in terms of taking in people from all over the world and forming some kind of, not melting pot, but tossed salad. The other country I know about that's like that is Israel. Because Israel gathered in Jewish refugees, not just from Eastern Europe, but from all the countries of the Middle East, which when, in 1948, when the United Nations declared 2 states, Israel and Palestine, the Arab states that then waged war to say, no, we don't accept the United Nations borders, we're going to war for all of the Transjordan all the way to the Mediterranean. All of the Jews who had been living in Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq for 2,000 years, vibrant cultures rooted in Jewish tradition, but speaking Arabic and being influenced by that culture, they were expelled. They were discriminated against. They were experiencing horrific discrimination in retaliation for the United Nations declaring that there will now be an Israel. Israel took in all those refugees, so there's a huge Middle Eastern population in Israel as well as in Eastern European. Now the Eastern Europeans have dominated government. It's been very difficult for people from the Mizrahi culture, the Middle Eastern culture. There are Jews from, I'm going way away from, this is far off topic, but the point is there are Jews from Ethiopia, there are Jews from India, there are Jewish refugees who went to China, and that forms a multicultural, and the same struggles are going on in Israel for equality among cultures as are going on in the US. I go off on these tangents because this is a part of my identity. So if you want to know who I am, you're going to hear about a global perspective. And that's something I love about living in Boulder, because many people in Boulder do not just focus on what's going on in the city of Boulder, the county, the state, or the US. A global perspective is also validated in this community, and it's part of who I am.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, you had asked about the name Tribe 13. And so when some of us decided, okay, we'd like to be a havurah within Nevei Kodesh, we needed a name. And I think Jeannie came up with the name. I wasn't present at the naming. I kind of came late to the formal part of it. My friend Jim, another co-founder of Tribe 13, part of the Seder group, a long-time queer activist and leader in the queer community and the Jewish community, says that it's to represent the tribe that has always been present within the other 12 tribes. Not necessarily visible, often hidden. So the 12 tribes of Israel has always had this embedded tribe within the tribes. We are the 13th tribe. Interestingly enough, Reb Tirza pointed out that the Hebrew letters that spell gay, if you were transliterating the word gay into Hebrew, you would use Gimel and Yud. And in Kabbalistic numerology, which is called Gematria, the letters Gimel and Yud add up to 13. We didn't know that, but so it became. Several members of Tribe 13 have served on the board of Nevei Kodesh. They've served on committees. I've always been celebrated and welcomed within Nevei Kodesh. I wouldn't belong to a spiritual group that didn't celebrate and recognize. But it's very important to say that being visible, being celebrated as leaders, being valued. I had a member of the congregation, I was congratulating somebody on their wedding the other day, and their response to me was, I hope someday I can be congratulating you on the legality of your wedding in Colorado.
Zhenya, I'd like to thank you very much for this interview. And this will be the end of the interview. So thanks again.
Thank you for asking me.
Sure.